Close your eyes, or let them rest halfway open. Tonight we are not going anywhere exciting. We are not chasing kings, or battles, or plots. Tonight we are going somewhere quiet, somewhere cold and stone and very, very slow. We are going inside the walls of a medieval monastery, somewhere in the hills of 11th or 12th century Europe. It does not matter exactly where, England, France, Italy, the details blur together after enough centuries. There is a stone building surrounded by fields and a low wall. Inside that wall, a few dozen men have given up almost everything a person can give up: their families, their names, in a way, their opinions about what time they wake up, what they eat, when they speak, and when they stay silent. They call this life the rule, and for hundreds of years it shaped the days of thousands of people across Europe, one bell at a time. Tonight we are going to walk through a single ordinary day in that life. Not a day of drama, a day of routine, of repetition, of small, careful, endless tasks done again and again until the tasks themselves became a kind of prayer. There is nothing here that needs your full attention. Let your mind drift in and out. Somewhere between the first bell of the morning and the last silence of the night you may find yourself asleep. That's all right. That's rather the point. Let's begin, gently, before the sun rises. Before we follow a single day, it helps to understand how a man ended up behind these walls at all. Some came because they wanted to. A younger son of a noble family, with no land to inherit, might be given to the church almost as a career choice, a respectable, comfortable way to spend a life, with food, shelter, and a kind of quiet dignity that a poor knight-errant could never guarantee. Some came because they were devout, genuinely moved by belief, wanting nothing more than a life spent close to what they understood as God. And some came as children, offered by their parents to a monastery as what was called an oblate, a gift dedicated to religious life before they were even old enough to choose it themselves. Imagine that for a moment. A boy of 7 or 8, brought by his father to the gates of an abbey, and left there, not out of cruelty, necessarily. Often it was seen as an act of devotion, a family's offering to God, and a guarantee that the child would be fed, educated, and cared for in an age when neither food nor education were guaranteed to anyone. But still, a 7-year-old, watching his father's cart disappear down the road, now belonging to men in dark robes who spoke mostly in silence and bells. Whatever brought a man to the monastery gates, the process of becoming a monk was slow, deliberately so. First came the postulancy, weeks or months simply living among the monks, observing, being observed in turn. Then the novitiate, a year or more of training, prayer, and testing, under the care of a novice master whose job was to see whether this new arrival could really live the life, or whether the silence and the labor would break him. Only after that trial did a man take his vows, usually vows of obedience, stability, and conversion of life, promising to remain in this one community until death. Not poverty, chastity, and obedience exactly, in the way later monastic orders phrased it, but close enough in spirit. From that day forward, his old name might be set aside for a new one. His old clothes were given away. And in a very real sense, his old life ended. He was given a robe, a cowl, a cord for his waist. He was assigned a place in choir, a place at the table, a place among his brothers that he would keep, in most cases, for the rest of his life. Long before sunrise, often around 2 in the morning, sometimes earlier depending on the season and the order, a bell would ring. There was no snooze button in the medieval world, no second chance at sleep. The bell rang, and the monks rose from narrow wooden beds in a shared dormitory that was almost always cold, often unheated even in the depths of winter, because comfort of the body was considered, quite literally, a distraction from the comfort of the soul. They slept in their robes, or in simple undergarments, so that rising quickly required no fumbling with clothes in the dark. Within minutes, in near total silence, rows of men would file down a set of stairs, sometimes built specifically to connect the dormitory directly to the church, so that no time and no warmth was wasted on the walk. This first prayer of the day was called matins, sometimes combined with lauds, depending on the order and century. It might last an hour or more. Psalms, read or sung in Latin, echoing off cold stone walls in the almost dark, lit by a few candles or oil lamps. Many of the monks would not have understood every word of the Latin perfectly. Latin was learned, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes by rote, but the sound of it, repeated night after night, year after year, became something the body knew even when the mind had gone hazy with sleep. Imagine standing in that cold stone room, your breath visible in the candlelight, chanting words you have said 10,000 times before, at an hour when every instinct in your body wants nothing more than to lie back down. This was not occasional. This was every single night for the entire length of a monk's life, summer and winter, health and sickness, except in the most severe cases. There was no version of monastic life that allowed you to simply decide, tonight, to sleep through it. And when it was over, when the final psalm had been sung and the final prayer whispered, the monks did not necessarily go back to bed. Depending on the season, they might have an hour or two before the next office began. Some used this time for private prayer, or reading, or simply sitting quietly in the darkness of the church, waiting for the next bell. The medieval monastic day was not measured in hours, the way we measure them now. It was measured in prayers. There were 8 of these fixed prayer times, spread across a single day and night, known collectively as the divine office, or the canonical hours. Matins and lauds, which we've just heard, came first, deep in the night. Then came prime, at first light, a short prayer marking the formal beginning of the working day. Then terce, around what we would call mid-morning. Sext, at midday. None, in the mid-afternoon. Vespers, as the sun began to set. And finally, compline, the last prayer before sleep. 7, sometimes 8, distinct returns to the church, every single day, forever punctuating whatever work a monk was doing. Weeding a garden, copying a manuscript, tending a sick brother in the infirmary. Whatever it was, the bell would ring, and the task would be set down. Not finished, necessarily, just set down. And the monk would walk, in practiced silence, back to his place in choir. This rhythm is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is so different from how most of us organize our days now. There was no single large block of work time followed by rest time. The day was constantly interrupted, constantly returned to its center point, which was prayer. Historians have sometimes described this as living by a clock that ticked in prayers rather than minutes, and in a way that's exactly what it was. Some monasteries even built or acquired early mechanical clocks specifically to help keep this schedule precise, making them, oddly enough, among the first communities in Europe to care deeply about exact timekeeping. Between each of these offices, ordinary time filled the gaps, although ordinary is a strange word for a life disstructured. A monk's morning after prime might be spent at manual labor. Depending on the size and wealth of the monastery, this could mean almost anything. Working in the vegetable gardens, tending bees, threshing grain, chopping firewood, hauling water, or laboring in the fields alongside lay brothers and hired workers. The Rule of Saint Benedict, the most influential guide to monastic life across medieval Western Europe. Put it simply, idleness is the enemy of the soul. Monks were meant to work with their hands as much as they prayed with their voices. Physical labor was not seen as beneath a religious life. It was, in its own way, a form of devotion. Sweat and dirt under the fingernails were not signs of a failed vocation. They were simply part of it. Not every monk spent his mornings in the mud. In many larger, wealthier monasteries, a select group of monks worked instead in a room called the scriptorium, the writing room. Here, in near total silence, broken only by the occasional soft scratch of a quill or the quiet request for more ink, monks copied books by hand. This was, before the invention of the printing press, one of the only ways that texts survived at all. Religious works, certainly. Bibles, psalters, prayer books, but also classical texts, fragments of Roman philosophy, Greek medicine, ancient histories. A remarkable amount of what we know today about the ancient world exists only because some monk, centuries ago, sat hunched over a wooden desk in a cold stone room, copying letter by careful letter, page after page, for months at a time. The work was slow beyond anything we can easily imagine now. A single illuminated manuscript, a decorated, ornate copy of a religious text, might take a monk a year or more to complete. Every letter formed by hand, every decorative border painted with pigments made from crushed minerals and plant dyes, some more expensive than gold. Blue, for instance, often came from a stone called lapis lazuli, mined thousands of miles away and imported at enormous cost, simply so that the robes of a painted saint might shine the correct, holy shade of blue. The monks who did this work were often called scribes, and among them a smaller number were illuminators, the ones skilled enough to paint the elaborate decorated letters and small scenes that filled the margins of the finest manuscripts. It was detailed, exhausting, eye-straining labor, done by candlelight or the grey daylight through a small window, hour after hour, in silence. Mistakes happened, of course. Historians have found small notes scribbled by tired scribes in the margins of surviving manuscripts. Brief, human complaints left behind almost 1,000 years ago. Notes about the cold, about aching hands, about how relieved a scribe felt to finally reach the last page of a long and difficult text. These tiny, informal comments are some of the only truly personal voices that survive from monks who otherwise left behind nothing but careful, anonymous copies of someone else's words. In this way, the scriptorium was both the quietest room in the monastery, and in its own slow, patient way, one of the most important rooms in all of medieval Europe. Food in a medieval monastery was simple, modest, and carefully regulated, though perhaps not quite as harsh as popular imagination sometimes suggests. Most monasteries ate 2 meals a day during much of the year, sometimes only one during periods of fasting such as Lent. Meat from 4-legged animals was frequently forbidden entirely or reserved only for the sick in the infirmary, though fish, eggs, cheese, and bread were generally allowed. Vegetables from the monastery's own gardens made up a large part of the diet. Beans, cabbage, onions, leeks, along with bread, and in many regions a modest allowance of ale or wine, which at the time was often considered safer to drink than untreated water. Meals themselves were eaten in near total silence, in a large communal room called the refectory. While the brothers ate, one monk would often read aloud from a religious text, or the life of a saint, so that even eating became an occasion for reflection rather than simple conversation. If a monk needed something passed to him, the salt, the bread, a cup, he used hand signals rather than speaking. Entire systems of monastic sign language developed in some communities, precise gestures for dozens of common items and requests, all so that the discipline of silence could be maintained even at the table. Fasting was a significant part of monastic life beyond just Lent. Certain days of the week, certain seasons of the church calendar, called for reduced meals or for abstaining from particular foods. This was not about deprivation for its own sake, in the monk's own understanding of it, but about discipline, training the body to want less, so that the mind might be less distracted by wanting. That said, monasteries were not always as austere as the rules suggested on paper. Over the centuries, especially in wealthier abbeys, some communities grew more comfortable than their founders likely intended, with better food, more wine, and softer routines creeping in gradually. This was, in fact, one of the recurring tensions in monastic history. A cycle of strict reform followed by gradual relaxation, followed eventually by a new reform movement trying to bring communities back to something closer to their original, simpler intentions. Silence was perhaps the single most defining feature of monastic life, more than the prayers, more than the labor, more even than the robes. Most monasteries observed what was called the Great Silence, a period from the evening prayer of Compline until after the morning offices, during which no monk was permitted to speak at all, for any reason short of genuine emergency. But even outside of this formal period, unnecessary talking was discouraged constantly, everywhere, at almost all hours. The cloister, the covered walkway surrounding the central courtyard, where monks walked, read, and sometimes worked, was meant to be a place of quiet reflection, not conversation. This constant, cultivated silence shaped the monks in ways that are hard for us to fully imagine now, living as we do in a world filled with almost constant sound and conversation. Some monks, historical accounts suggest, found this silence difficult, even painful, particularly in their early years. Others came to treasure it deeply, describing it later in letters or writings as one of the most valuable gifts of the monastic life. A permission, finally, to stop performing conversation and simply exist. When a monk fell ill, he was moved to the infirmary, a separate building or wing set apart from the main dormitory, where the ordinary rules of monastic life were relaxed. Here, meat was permitted, even encouraged, to help rebuild strength. Extra warmth was allowed. Rest was allowed, without the guilt that might accompany idleness elsewhere in the monastery. One or more monks were often assigned specifically as infirmarians, tasked with the care of the sick, and many monasteries developed real expertise in medicine, growing extensive herb gardens specifically for remedies, and maintaining what were, for their time, some of the more sophisticated medical libraries in Europe. Death, when it came, was met the way almost everything else in monastic life was met, with ritual, with community, and without panic. A dying monk was rarely left alone. His brothers would gather, pray over him, sit with him through his final hours. When death came, the entire community would be informed, prayers would be said for his soul, and he would be buried, usually within the monastery grounds itself, among generations of brothers who had lived and died there before him. In this way, even in death, a monk remained exactly where he had spent his entire adult life, inside the walls, among his brothers, following, one final time, the same quiet rhythms that had shaped every single day since the morning he first arrived. As the light faded each evening, the monastery moved toward vespers, and then finally toward Compline. The very last prayer of the day, the formal close of every single day's long, repeating cycle. Compline was often the gentlest of the offices, shorter, quieter, sung or spoken in a lower register than the more formal daytime prayers. Many of the psalms and prayers associated with Compline speak of protection through the night, of trust, of rest, fitting words for the final moments before a monk returned, once more, to his narrow bed, knowing that in only a few hours the bell for matins would call him back into the cold and the dark and the candlelight all over again. After Compline came the great silence we spoke of earlier, and with it, for most monks, sleep. Not long sleep by our standards. Broken, interrupted sleep, split across the night by that first midnight bell. Historians who study medieval sleep patterns have noted that this kind of segmented sleep, a period of rest, an interruption, and then a second period of rest, was not unique to monasteries. It appears to have been fairly common across much of medieval and early modern society more broadly, monastery or not. Some researchers have suggested that this two-part sleep, sometimes called first sleep and second sleep, may even have been closer to a natural human pattern before the widespread use of artificial lighting made a single, unbroken block of night sleep more common and more expected. If that's true, then in a strange way, the monks may have simply been living, deliberately and religiously, a rhythm that much of the rest of their world was living too, almost without noticing it. Bells instead of birdsong, prayer instead of idle thought, but the same fundamental shape underneath. Wake in the dark, rest again, wake with the light, begin once more, day after day, season after season, year after year, for the whole of a monk's adult life, from the morning he first walked through the monastery gates until the day, decades later, his brothers carried him to his resting place within those same walls. It is worth asking, now, so many centuries later, why any of this mattered. Why thousands of men, across hundreds of years, chose, or were given, or grew into, a life this repetitive, this restrained, this quiet. Part of the answer, of course, is simple religious devotion, a genuine belief, for many of these men, that this discipline of prayer and labor and silence brought them closer to something sacred. That is not something we need to fully share in order to understand its power for the people who lived it. But there is another answer too, one that has less to do with belief and more to do with human need. In a world that was outside the monastery walls, often chaotic, violent, uncertain, and short, plague, famine, war, and sudden death were constant possibilities for almost everyone in medieval Europe. The monastery offered something rare: structure, predictability. The same bell, at the same hour, calling the same prayer, every single day, for an entire lifetime. In a world with very little certainty, a monk could be certain, at least, of what tomorrow would ask of him. And in that slow, repeating rhythm, something else quietly happened too. Libraries were preserved. Ancient texts survived, copied by patient hands in silent rooms when they might otherwise have been lost entirely. Herb gardens grew into genuine centers of medical knowledge. Farming techniques were refined and passed down. Music, particularly the long tradition of chant that filled those cold stone churches every night, developed and evolved in ways that still echo, distantly, in music today. None of it happened quickly. None of it happened dramatically. It happened bell by bell, prayer by prayer, page by careful page, across centuries, in rooms very much like the ones we've walked through tonight. So as you drift off now, if you haven't already, picture that stone dormitory one more time, the narrow bed, the quiet dark. Somewhere, far off in your mind, a distant bell that will not ring again for hours yet. There is nothing to do right now, no prayer to rise for, no page to copy, no field to tend, just rest, just the quiet, just the long, slow dark before the next bell.